The phone screen lights up the dark room. Another Instagram notification has just arrived. You've probably received one of these before. A video call invitation from someone you don't even know. Maybe you accepted it, or maybe you ignored it. But what if this simple act of curiosity was the beginning of something that would change your life forever? What if this stranger wasn't really a stranger, but someone who already knew everything about you, your routine, your favorite places? Have you ever stopped to think about how, in a world as connected as ours, digital interactions can cross the screen barrier and invade our privacy in unimaginable ways? This is the digital nightmare of a photographer in New York. A simple video invitation, accepted impulsively, turns into something so disturbing that he will never see Instagram the same way again. Lucas, a photographer who spends his days immersed in the art of capturing moments, never imagined his camera could be used against him. His work had always been his life, a lens through which he could observe the world, but he never imagined that the world would start observing him back in such a sinister way. Let's be honest, who hasn't felt a little anxious when opening a message from a stranger on social media? A hi from an unknown person, an invitation for a video chat. It seems harmless, almost routine, but what happens when this stranger isn't just someone wanting a random conversation? What happens when they already know things about you that you've never shared? The photographer from New York wasn't prepared for this. The first thing he thought was, who's calling me? It must be a fellow photographer or someone from the city. But it wasn't. It was a stranger with a cold smile on the screen. He was invited to a simple chat, but soon found himself immersed in a cat-and-mouse game where the rules were set by this unknown person. The stranger knew where he had been, what he had done, even the places he frequented. How did he know this? He began to realize that the call wasn't just about him. It was about control, manipulation of his online presence, and the price of digital exposure. And here's the big question. Do you think you're safe just because you keep your profiles private? Or that blocking a stranger solves everything? This photographer thought the same until he realized that logging out of his account, hanging up the call, and even deleting messages wasn't enough. The stranger was in his life in ways he could never have imagined. But wait, this is just the beginning. When he tried to escape, the threat intensified. It was no longer about the call itself. It was about what would happen next. He found himself trapped in a cycle where every move he made seemed to be watched, every click monitored, and the feeling of being observed invisibly was something he could never have predicted. What once seemed like a simple digital game turned into a psychological nightmare. You, the viewer, might be wondering, am I vulnerable like this too? And the answer is not simple. We are all connected to this digital world in such deep ways that we often can't see the traps it hides. But what happens when these invisible threads begin to intertwine with our real life? How would you protect your privacy when everything you share online is, in some way, visible to others? Now, imagine the feeling of being watched without knowing by whom, from where, or with what intent. And if everything you've shared, even the smallest detail, were used against you. This is no longer fiction. It is an increasingly present digital reality. What happened to the photographer from New York was no accident. He believed that by controlling his social media, he had control over his digital life. But as we'll see, control over what we see, what we know, and even what we feel on social media can be an illusion. And who's behind that screen could be much more dangerous than he ever imagined. Now, are you ready to find out how far this photographer will go to try to escape an online presence he never should have allowed to exist? Here's the translation of the next part into English. The photographer, Lucas, lived the fast-paced routine of New York City, where the city never sleeps and opportunities are on every corner. He worked as a freelancer, capturing the essence of neighborhoods, people, and fleeting moments. His camera was his lens to the world, his tool of expression. What he loved about his work was the freedom, the ability to explore all angles, but also how immersed he was in the digital world. His photos were posted, shared, and commented on. Each click became a form of currency in the social media landscape. But that morning, something felt different. Lucas felt disconnected, exhausted. The pressure to produce more and more, the endless sea of constant notifications and the job requests had begun to weigh him down. He was 32 years old and felt like he was becoming a cog in a system he barely understood. But as a photographer, he knew the value of exposure. It's all marketing, he told himself, even though he wasn't entirely convinced of that. As he scrolled through his social media, a notification caught his attention. It wasn't a message from a client or a comment on one of his photos. It was an invitation for a video call on Instagram. The sender's name was blank, with no photo or any identifying information about who was on the other side. Curious, Lucas hesitated for a moment. It must be someone wanting to work with me, he thought. But curiosity got the better of him, and he pressed the button to accept. The screen flickered, and for a moment, the connection took a while to stabilize. When the image finally appeared, what Lucas saw was a familiar yet unsettling face. It was as if it was someone he'd seen before, but at the same time, he couldn't identify them. The stranger's eyes were fixed on the screen with a vacant, almost forced smile. Something wasn't right. The stranger began speaking casually, asking about Lucas's work, how he got started in photography. But soon the tone of the conversation shifted. He mentioned specific places Lucas had recently been, places he had never shared online, not even with his friends. A shiver ran down the photographer's spine. How did he know that? More than that, how did he know intimate details of his life? Things Lucas had never posted or told anyone. Before Lucas could process all of this, the stranger went straight to the point. You have a good life, Lucas, but that can be easily lost. You know what can happen to people who expose so much of themselves on the internet, don't you? Lucas tried to regain his composure, nervously laughing, trying not to show the growing discomfort. You're scaring me, he said, more as an attempt to joke than anything else. But the response came quickly, coldly. I'm not joking. The conversation dragged on, but with each word, Lucas felt more trapped. It was no longer a simple video call. It was a trap, a psychological game he didn't know how to play. And no matter how hard he tried to leave the conversation, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. Lucas tried to stay calm, but the discomfort was becoming impossible to ignore. He stared at the screen, trying to understand who this stranger was and why he seemed to know so much about him. The image on the screen flickered strangely, as if the stranger was deliberately manipulating the connection. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. You know, Lucas, many people in your position end up getting lost, the stranger said, his voice soft but full of unsettling authority. The search for followers, likes, validation. But have you ever wondered how far this can go? What do you really share when you post a photo, when you show a part of your life? Lucas swallowed hard. He knew his digital life was more exposed than he liked to admit, but he had always believed the control was in his hands. The photos he shared were mostly artistic, almost disconnected from his personal life. But now, in front of this stranger, he started to question everything he believed about privacy and exposure. I'm just a photographer, Lucas responded, trying to change the subject. I just do my job. The stranger smiled, but there was something disturbing in the way he looked at Lucas. Yes, of course, your job. But you've forgotten one small detail, Lucas. You're not just photographing the world. You're being photographed too. And when you share your moments, you're leaving traces. Traces I can follow. Lucas's face turned pale. He began to feel as though he had been transported to another reality. What had once seemed like an innocent conversation had turned into something much darker. What did the stranger want from him? Was it a threat or just a psychological manipulation? But why was he doing this? What would he gain from all of this? Before he could think of an answer, the phone screen flickered again, and the stranger appeared even closer to the camera, his face now dominating the screen. You have something I want, Lucas. Something you don't realize, but it's right in front of your eyes. The feeling of claustrophobia grew. Lucas tried to disconnect again, but the power button was inactive. Panic began to take over him. He felt pressure in his chest, as though he was being physically cornered. The idea that the stranger could have access to his physical world, his apartment, his movements, started to feel more real than ever. He was trapped, both in the call and in his mind, not knowing how to get out. Why are you doing this? Lucas managed to ask, his voice now faltering, almost desperate. The stranger, still with that unsettling smile, gave one last response that chilled Lucas to the bone. Because, Lucas, you can't hide anymore. I know where you are, and I can go wherever you go. The screen remained static for a moment, and Lucas felt as if the air around him was growing denser. He was no longer just in a video call. He was being consumed by something much bigger, much more dangerous. The tension in the room was almost palpable. The clock on the wall seemed to crawl, marking time relentlessly as Lucas tried to understand what was happening. He felt trapped, not just physically in the video call, but emotionally in a web of manipulations and threats he didn't understand. Each word from the stranger increased the weight on his shoulders. He tried to look around his apartment, searching for an exit, some way to escape. But the environment seemed to close in on him with each passing second. He knew something was terribly wrong, but what exactly? Why was a stranger investing so much time and energy in scaring him? And the most disturbing thing of all, what was the goal of this twisted game? Suddenly, the conversation took a sharp turn. The stranger stopped talking about photos, social media, and digital footprints. He fell silent for a moment, just watching Lucas with an enigmatic smile. The photographer tried to stay calm, but his body was tense, his hands sweating. Then the stranger leaned in closer to the camera, as if ready to reveal something he knew would leave Lucas speechless. You know, Lucas, when you start exposing your life, you end up attracting the wrong people. Some of these people have, let's say, not very healthy interests. Lucas swallowed hard, feeling a wave of dread spread through his body. He knew the stranger was about to say something that would change everything. And then, the stranger made a revelation Lucas never could have imagined. You know about the 6 missing people in New York, right? The stranger asked calmly, as if discussing something trivial. All those disappearances, well, let's call them accidents. They all happened after interactions with a certain person. You understand, don't you? Lucas froze, unsure of how to react. He tried to recall the disappearance cases that had made headlines a few weeks ago, but he didn't see the connection. The stranger continued, It happens that, before you, I've already had other encounters. The stranger paused, his voice now lower, almost whispering. And those people, they just disappeared. Each one of them, a simple video call, a simple click. And now I'm the only one who knows what happened to them. Lucas's blood ran cold. He didn't know whether what he was hearing was true, but the coldness in the stranger's voice, the disturbing smile on his face, made the narrative seem real. The revelation hit him with the force of a blow. The stranger wasn't just manipulating his mind. He was talking about murders, deaths, and Lucas was somehow involved in this. The line between the digital and the real, between the game and life, was blurred. I never leave traces, Lucas, the stranger said with a sinister smile, and neither will you. Lucas felt his breath quicken. He was in shock, unable to fully process what he had just heard. But one thing was clear. He wasn't dealing with a simple stalker or digital manipulator. He was dealing with someone much more dangerous. Lucas froze in front of the phone screen. The air seemed to have grown heavier, as if the environment had turned into a prison. He didn't know how to react to that macabre revelation. If it was true, he was facing something much bigger than a simple digital nightmare. The stranger was talking about 6 murders, 6 lives taken, and somehow he was connected to all of it. Panic began to take over him, but he knew he couldn't show weakness. Not here, not now. He needed to understand what was happening and, more importantly, how to get out of this situation. He looked out the window, trying to mentally distance himself from what he had just heard. But the view of the city outside only heightened his sense of confinement. New York, with all its grandeur and light, now seemed like a labyrinth of shadows, where every corner could be hiding real danger. Lucas remembered when he was in places like Central Park, taking photos of tourists and locals, enjoying the outdoors, the movement of the city. Now that same setting seemed threatening, as if he could be watched from any place. The park, which used to be a refuge, now felt like just another place where the stranger could be, lurking somewhere, watching him without him knowing. Meanwhile, the stranger's voice seemed to drag on, filling every space in his mind. Each word sank deeper into his head, as if he was drowning in a sea of fear and despair. The idea of facing a digital murderer, someone who controlled his life in such a subtle, invisible way, was terrifying. He tried to convince himself that the stranger was just lying, maybe trying to manipulate his emotions, but something in his voice, the way he spoke about the disappearances, made him believe that somehow this was real. The case of the 6 missing people in New York, the stranger continued, breaking the silence that had settled. Maybe you've heard about them. They all had one thing in common. They were lured to me through social media. It all started with a simple video call. They thought they were just meeting someone new, but instead, they met death. Lucas felt a lump in his throat. He knew about the disappearances, of course. It was impossible not to. The news had been talking about it for weeks. People who seemingly disappeared out of nowhere, leaving no trace. The first victim had been a young influencer who used to frequent places like Times Square for her live broadcasts. She shared her life with millions of followers, always smiling, always willing to show her routine. But after a mysterious video call, she was seen for the last time. Her body was never found, but her last post seemed to show a face filled with sheer terror. The police had no leads, and the case seemed to fade into the news pages. After her, others disappeared in a similar fashion. A fashion designer who had been attending an event in Brooklyn, a DJ who performed at a famous nightclub in Chelsea, a Manhattan lawyer who was working late on an important case. They all received video call invitations, and all disappeared without a trace. The only connection between them seemed to be this strange invitation, which for some reason caused them to vanish. The stranger knew all of this. He was talking about what had happened to each of them with a chilling calmness, as if it was just another story he had told dozens of times. And Lucas, now, was at the center of this macabre plot. "You know what happened to them, Lucas?" the stranger said, almost sweetly. "But maybe you still haven't understood the real intention behind this. It's not just about eliminating people. It's about showing what happens when exposure becomes our prison." Lucas felt his blood run cold. He could no longer maintain his composure. The image of the stranger, getting closer and closer to the camera, seemed to grow in his mind. He was being manipulated, led down a path he didn't know how to stop. It was as if he were a puppet, with the stranger holding the strings and controlling his every move. Trying to regain control of the situation, Lucas took a deep breath and tried to shift the focus. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, trying to sound firmer. "You can threaten me, talk about the disappearances, but that's not going to change my mind." The stranger laughed softly, a hollow and cruel laugh. "You don't understand, Lucas. I don't need you to change your mind. I need you to understand the only rule that exists in my game. The control was never with you. It has always been mine. Now, you're a part of it." The idea of being just another piece in a twisted game shook Lucas's mind. He looked around his apartment again, trying to understand exactly where he was, where exactly he was being watched. But the answer seemed obvious now. He wasn't just being watched by a stranger, but by something much bigger, something he could never fully comprehend. The stranger's words began to pound in his head, and he felt an emptiness expanding inside him. He was in danger. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about survival. He needed to uncover the truth, understand who this man was, and what he really wanted, and most importantly, how to stop him from becoming the next victim. But as Lucas tried to formulate a plan to escape, the stranger was already one step ahead, controlling every movement. And he knew exactly what to do to trap Lucas even further in the web of lies and deaths he had created. Lucas felt the pressure of every word the stranger said. It wasn't just the fear of death that dominated him, but the growing sense of helplessness, as if he were trapped in a nightmare he didn't know how to wake up from. With every new sentence, he was pulled deeper, and his mind began to question what he really knew about this being. But the worst was yet to come. While he tried to process the stranger's threatening words, a new message appeared on his phone screen. He quickly read it, panic expanding in his chest. It was no longer just a simple text message. It was a photo. His photo. The picture had been taken at Brooklyn Bridge Park, a place where he used to spend time with his camera, capturing the incredible views of the river and the illuminated bridge. The image had been taken without his knowledge, and the most disturbing part was what it revealed. Someone was walking toward him, with a shadow behind him, watching him. He froze, his hands trembling as he held the phone. The stranger wasn't just manipulating his social media, he was physically close, monitoring every move he made. He looked out the window, his heart racing, but the street was empty, as always. He was in the safety of his apartment, or so he thought. The stranger seemingly had invaded not only his digital life but also his physical reality. Now, he wasn't just dealing with a virtual stalker. He was being hunted, and the worst part, he didn't know how far this game would go. He thought about going to the police, but quickly discarded the idea. The stranger already had total control. If he could infiltrate his social media, his messages, his photos, what would stop him from manipulating any evidence? He was dealing with something much bigger than just a digital criminal. He was being confronted by someone who had access to everything. With every passing moment, his privacy seemed to disintegrate. Desperate, Lucas decided to take drastic measures. He grabbed his computer and began trying to trace the stranger's IP address, hoping at least a clue would appear. But the computer wasn't responding the way it should. The screen started freezing, and he heard the familiar sound of an incoming message. But this time, the voice of the stranger didn't just come from his phone. He slowly turned around, a chill running down his spine, and saw a reflection on the computer screen. A smiling face, watching him through the window. Lucas knew, in that moment, that he no longer had control. He wasn't safe, even inside his own house. Panic spread through Lucas's whole body. His eyes were fixed on the computer screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the window, on the reflected image. The smiling face, the penetrating gaze of the stranger. He felt the pressure in his chest grow, his breathing getting harder. How was this possible? How was the stranger so close, so real? What started as a simple video call, a curiosity, had now turned into both a physical and psychological nightmare. He was being followed, watched from every angle, and had nowhere to run. He tried to push the image of the window away, but the reflection wouldn't leave his mind. The stranger's face remained there, watching him, like a shadow that was chasing him. He didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that he was being watched from outside, or what it said about his own vulnerability. He had always thought of himself as immune, believing that the control was in his hands. But now he understood that, within the digital world, he was just a piece in a macabre game. And the worst part was that the stranger knew this. But amidst the mental chaos, Lucas also felt something deeper. Shame. How could he have been so naive? How did he not realize earlier how exposed he was? His photos, his posts, the seemingly innocent messages he exchanged with followers and clients, all of that was now part of a large chessboard where he was the vulnerable piece. The privacy he had taken for granted was nothing but an illusion. He was now paying the price for his own exposure. The dilemma consuming Lucas wasn't just survival. It was understanding if there was any way to fight back. He knew asking the police for help would be useless. The stranger had complete control over the evidence, and any attempt at reporting him could easily be manipulated or erased. The feeling of helplessness consumed him even more. The stranger knew everything about him, perhaps more than he knew about his own digital life. He looked at his phone once more, trying to find some sign of hope. The screen was filled with notifications, but none seemed as important as the message he had just received. Another photo. This time, it was an image of his own street, taken from somewhere hidden. He didn't see anyone, but he knew he was being watched, that there was no safe place for him anymore. The idea of being hunted, of being in a constant race against time and against an invisible enemy, was exhausting. Lucas knew his only chance would be to turn the game around, but he didn't know how. The feeling of being consumed, of being swallowed by this dark digital world, made him question. Did he still have control over his life? Or had he already become a puppet in the hands of a stranger who understood him better than he did himself? The feeling of being trapped in a never-ending nightmare grew inside Lucas like a snowball. He was paralyzed, unsure of what his next move would be. The strangeness of the situation consumed him more and more. The reflection in the window wouldn't disappear, but he didn't dare look again. He didn't want to see the stranger's empty smile anymore, the feeling of being watched so intimately. Fear had now become a constant, like a shadow that stretched over his life. There was no escape. The sound of a notification echoing from Lucas's phone interrupted his thoughts. He didn't want to look, but his finger, almost automatically, went to the screen. When he saw the new message, his body froze. It wasn't just a regular message. It was a photo. His photo. The photo had been taken at Brooklyn Bridge Park, an area where he often spent time with his camera, capturing the stunning views of the river and the lit-up bridge. The image had been taken without his knowledge, and the most disturbing part was what it revealed. Someone was walking toward him, with a shadow behind him, watching him. He froze, his hands trembling as he held the phone. The stranger wasn't just manipulating his social media. He was physically close, monitoring his every move. He looked out the window, his heart pounding faster, but the street was empty, just as always. He was in the safety of his apartment, or so he thought. The stranger, apparently, had invaded not only his digital life, but also his physical reality. Now, he wasn't just dealing with a virtual stalker. He was being hunted. And the worst part, he didn't know how far this game would go. He thought about going to the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. The stranger already had total control. If he could infiltrate his social media, his messages, his photos, what would stop him from manipulating any evidence? He was dealing with something far greater than just a digital criminal. He was being confronted by someone who had access to everything. With every passing moment, his privacy seemed to disintegrate. Desperate, Lucas decided to take drastic action. He grabbed his computer and began trying to trace the stranger's IP address, hoping at least some clue would appear. But the computer wasn't responding the way it should. The screen started freezing, and he heard the familiar sound of an incoming message. But this time, the stranger's voice didn't just come from his phone. He slowly turned around, a chill running down his spine, and saw a reflection on the computer screen. A smiling face, watching him through the window. Lucas knew at that moment that he no longer had control. He wasn't safe, not even inside his own house. Panic spread through Lucas's entire body. His eyes were fixed on the computer screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the window, on the reflected image. The smiling face, the penetrating gaze of the stranger. He felt the pressure in his chest increase, his breathing becoming harder. How was this possible? How was the stranger so close, so real? What started as a simple video invitation, a curiosity, had now turned into both a physical and psychological nightmare. He was being followed, watched from all angles, and had nowhere to run. He tried to push the image of the window away, but the reflection wouldn't leave his mind. The stranger's face remained there, watching him, like a shadow chasing him. He didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that he was being watched from the outside, or what it said about his own vulnerability. He had always considered himself immune, believing that control was in his hands. But now he understood that within the digital realm, he was just a piece in a macabre game. And the worst part was that the stranger knew this. But amid the mental chaos, Lucas also felt something deeper: shame. How could he have been so naive? How did he not realize earlier how exposed he was? His photos, his posts, the seemingly innocent messages he exchanged with followers and clients, all of that was now part of a large chessboard, where he was the vulnerable piece. The privacy he had taken for granted was nothing but an illusion. He was now paying the price for his own exposure. The dilemma consuming Lucas wasn't just survival. It was understanding if there was any way to fight back. He knew asking the police for help would be useless. The stranger had complete control over the evidence, and any attempt to report him could easily be manipulated or erased. The feeling of helplessness consumed him even more. The stranger knew everything about him, perhaps even more than he knew about his own digital life. He looked at his phone once more, trying to find some sign of hope. The screen was filled with notifications, but none seemed as important as the message he had just received. Another photo. This time, it was an image of his own street, taken from somewhere hidden. He didn't see anyone, but he knew he was being watched, that there was no safe place for him anymore. The idea of being hunted, of being in a constant race against time and against an invisible enemy, was exhausting. Lucas knew his only chance would be to turn the game around, but he didn't know how. The feeling of being consumed, of being swallowed by this dark digital world, made him question, did he still have control over his life? Or had he already become a puppet in the hands of a stranger who understood him better than he did himself? Lucas was beginning to realize that the danger was no longer limited to the threatening messages. The stranger had penetrated his life in a deeper, more physical way than he had imagined. The photos of his street and the videos showing his apartment were proof that he was being watched, maybe even followed. Every movement of his was being monitored, as if the stranger were on every corner of New York City, ready to see him move. The growing discomfort turned into obsession. He tried to convince himself that he might just be paranoid, but the signs were clear. He thought about the disappearances, the victims who, like him, were exposed to the public, their lives shared on social media. He had always considered himself smart, cautious, but now he knew he was being manipulated, a pawn in a much larger game. Then he remembered something. All the previous victims were public figures, influencers, artists, people who lived off digital exposure. The pattern was there, clear, and Lucas was beginning to realize that his life as a photographer, with his photos and posts, had put him in the same line. The stranger seemed to choose his victims based on visibility, the desire for recognition, something Lucas knew well. He began to connect the dots: digital manipulation, online exposure, and the control exerted over people's lives. The stranger wasn't just after Lucas, he was after everyone like him, vulnerable to exposure. For the stranger, visibility was a flaw to be corrected, and Lucas was now at the center of this distorted mission. But Lucas's biggest dilemma was understanding how far this would go. He no longer knew what was real and what was manipulation. Every step seemed predicted, every move of his monitored. The stranger was one step ahead, and Lucas found himself lost in a game from which he didn't know how to escape. Now he had to make a choice: keep searching for more clues, or try to confront the stranger, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. He was no longer in control, but he couldn't afford to wait for the stranger to take the next step. Lucas felt the weight of the situation consuming him. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of fear, doubt, and frustration. Every new movement he made, every glance he cast around, seemed to be monitored. He was in a dead end, pressured by an invisible enemy who toyed with his mind, his fears, and his anxiety. Everything he had built in his digital life was being destroyed by a being who knew how to manipulate his perception of reality. As the days passed, Lucas felt more isolated. He tried going to the building security office, trying to trace the stranger through the streets of New York, but he couldn't trust anything anymore. He was being watched, hunted, and everything he did to protect himself seemed predictable to the enemy. He now found himself in a game of cat and mouse, where the rules were unclear. The stranger had already become a master of this psychological torture. In a final effort, Lucas decided to confront the stranger. He had to understand why he was being pursued, what the purpose of all of this was. He could no longer live with this feeling of being manipulated. He knew that if he didn't do something, he would be just another victim, another number on the list of missing people. With his phone in hand, he prepared to accept the next video invitation, with the feeling that this could be the final confrontation. He knew the stranger was waiting for this, but he was willing to risk everything to finally understand who the true enemy was. He took a deep breath and accepted the call. The image on the screen began to load slowly, and Lucas's heart raced. He felt the presence of the stranger on the other side, waiting for his reaction. But what he didn't expect was the image that appeared next. It was no longer the stranger's face, but a message instead. A single line of text. "Do you really think you can escape, Lucas?" Silence filled the room. The question hung in the air, loaded with an implicit threat. And Lucas realized he was no longer dealing with just a digital stalker. He was in a psychological game that had already crossed any limit of control. The message on Lucas's screen remained there, frozen for a moment that felt like an eternity. Do you really think you can escape, Lucas? He felt a wave of anger and desperation. The stranger was enjoying his suffering, controlling every movement, every thought. But at that moment, Lucas realized something crucial. The stranger was playing with him. Every movement, every decision was being manipulated. He was no longer just a victim, but a key piece in a psychological game. With cold calm, he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to concentrate. What did he know so far? The stranger had manipulated his digital life, infiltrated his most intimate spaces. He knew this was the final confrontation. It was time to turn the game around. On impulse, Lucas turned off his phone and grabbed his computer. He knew he had to find something the stranger didn't expect, something that would make him lose control. He began to investigate deeply, opening old files and photos. As he rummaged through them, his heart raced, but he didn't stop. He knew the clock was against him. With each passing second, the stranger was getting closer to his mind, closer to his real life. It was now or never. That's when he found a clue. In the middle of a corrupted file, an old photo appeared. It wasn't an image he had posted, but something the stranger had. An angle of one of his previous photos, but with a manipulation. Someone had altered his image, placing a shadowy figure in the scene, someone he vaguely recognized. The stranger had done this before, but why? What was the connection? Why alter his photos? Why interfere so much? As Lucas connected the pieces, a new notification appeared. It was a message from the stranger, but not just a simple threat. It was a riddle. If you manage to understand who's behind you, maybe you can escape. But remember, your life is just a part of the game. Find the next move, and you will survive. Fail, and the board will be reset. He got up from his chair, feeling a rush of adrenaline. What did the stranger want him to find? Time was running out. With the feeling that he was on the last move of a chess game, Lucas took a deep breath and prepared for the final confrontation. He knew the key was right there, in front of him. Each piece of the puzzle was beginning to fit together in a terrifying way. The clock seemed to be running against Lucas. His heart was pounding, beating in his chest with the intensity of a drum. Every second seemed to take him closer to the edge of a cliff, where any wrong move could be fatal. The stranger was always one step ahead, manipulating the environment, watching, controlling. But now Lucas had something the stranger didn't expect. A real clue, a path to follow. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit, but what he didn't know was that, deep down, the true revelation wouldn't come from something he'd find, but from a twist he never imagined. He sat down in front of the computer, staring at the altered photo. The manipulated image, showing a shadowy figure in one of his photos, led him to a crucial discovery. He remembered something vital, something he had never considered. Those photos weren't his, not even from places he recognized. They were photos taken by someone else, from angles he had never captured. Suddenly, everything made sense. The stranger wasn't just infiltrating his life. He had created a copy of his digital identity, and somehow, he was controlling everything. Lucas wasn't being watched just by the stranger. He was being manipulated by him. The stranger wasn't just any stalker. He was someone who had meticulously studied his life, his habits, his preferences, even his most personal photos. But there was more. The pieces of the puzzle moved, and Lucas realized that this stranger wasn't acting alone. He had manipulated both the digital and real world so that Lucas now was trapped in a web of lies and games, an experiment he hadn't asked for but was now part of. "You're closer than you think, Lucas." The message appeared on his screen, with a calm that chilled him to the bone. The stranger knew exactly what he was thinking, what he was feeling, but there was a deeper layer that still eluded his understanding. The real game wasn't about defeating the stranger, but understanding who he really was. And the answer was right in front of Lucas, in all the details he had ignored until then. As Lucas delved further into his investigations, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was another message from the stranger, but now it wasn't a direct threat. The message contained an encrypted link, something Lucas hesitated to open. But he had no more time to hesitate. Curiosity consumed him. He clicked the link. The computer screen suddenly changed. The white background turned black, and an image appeared. It was a recording of a video call. Lucas, in shock, recognized the scene. It was himself on the screen, but not in a way he remembered. The recording showed Lucas in a vulnerable moment, in a place he had never visited, in a house that wasn't his. He was in a video conference with the stranger. But now, he clearly saw what was happening. The face on the screen was no longer the stranger's, but his own. Lucas saw himself smiling, with a vacant look, a facial expression of someone who was being controlled by an invisible force. He realized, horrified, that he wasn't just watching a simple video. He was watching the process of his own manipulation. The stranger, in reality, wasn't behind him. He was inside him. The game wasn't about hiding or escaping. He was already trapped, already part of something much bigger than he imagined. Every choice Lucas thought he had made was actually part of a sequence orchestrated by the stranger himself. The stranger hadn't infiltrated his life. He had created it, shaped it, just as an artist creates a sculpture, molding every piece of Lucas's digital existence until he became the very piece. Lucas's reality began to disintegrate before him. He was no longer being chased. He was being shaped, reformed into something he didn't recognize. He was no longer a victim, but a puppet in the stranger's hands. And the most terrifying part was that, up until that moment, he hadn't known it. He had always thought he was fighting for his life, when in reality, he was merely accepting his role in the story the stranger had created. What seemed like a quest for revenge or a simple game of manipulation turned into something far more complex. Lucas had been chosen, not because he was just any target, but because the stranger saw in him a reflection. He, the photographer, had created a digital life where he was observed, molded, and watched. The stranger didn't just want to control him. He wanted to show Lucas that he had no control over anything. What the stranger had done, in fact, was turn Lucas into part of his own masterpiece, where suffering was the message and fear, the canvas. Disoriented, Lucas stood up from his chair, the computer and phone becoming blurs in his vision. He felt a tremor in his body. The air felt thick, as if he couldn't breathe. He had no idea what was happening anymore. What seemed like the peak of the tension revealed itself as only the beginning of something much deeper. He had fallen into a trap, and there was no way to escape. The strangeness now consumed his very mind, and he, the photographer, the creator, had become the creation, at the mercy of something he could never understand. Lucas was on the brink of collapse. The truth he had just uncovered felt overwhelming. He was no longer an observer of his own life. He was a piece, a creation, a puppet in the hands of an invisible master. The memories and decisions he thought he had made on his own were being manipulated all along. The stranger wasn't just behind him. He was part of the structure he had created. The line between the real and the virtual had disappeared. Panic and anger mixed inside him, a storm of emotions that was difficult to process. Control, something he had always sought, was completely out of his hands. He had been used. He had been an invention of a being who had studied him, observing his weaknesses and feeding on them. Then something unexpected happened. The computer screen began to flicker, and instead of the stranger's face, a new image appeared. An old photo, taken in a cafe in Brooklyn. The image was distorted, but the scene seemed familiar. Lucas leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed it. At the table, in the background, he recognized the person sitting next to him in the photo. Himself. A younger version of himself, maybe 3 years ago. What was this? How could it be possible that he was there, so disconnected from the reality he thought he had lived? The truth seemed to deconstruct everything. The photo wasn't just a memory, it was a key. The stranger hadn't just manipulated his digital life, he had designed it. Every moment Lucas believed he had lived, his arrival in the city, his first steps as a photographer, the excitement of capturing the world through his lens. All of it was part of a grand theater. Every movement of his had been calculated, every choice a piece of a puzzle he had unknowingly put together. You can't see it, can you, Lucas? The message appeared on his screen once again. You are the center of all this. I created you. The shock ran through his spine. He had been manipulated from the start. But the most terrifying part wasn't the manipulation. The most terrifying part was that somehow he was beginning to understand why. He had wanted so badly to be seen, to be recognized, that he had become part of the very game the stranger was playing. The need for validation had made him vulnerable to this invasion. He had unknowingly become a product of his own quest for attention and recognition. The stranger hadn't created a victim. He had created a story, a narrative with characters he himself had shaped. In reality, he was an invention of his own insecurities, a construct meant to be observed, manipulated, and then discarded. Lucas finally understood. He was in a cycle, a never-ending spiral. The stranger was never just a stalker. He was a representation of what Lucas feared most, being consumed by an identity that was no longer his, by a game he had nurtured himself. With one last breath, Lucas felt the weight of his own discovery. He was no longer fighting against the stranger. He was fighting against his own need to be seen, to be validated. He was finally ready to step out of the role of puppet, to break the story the stranger had created. What he needed to do now wasn't to escape. It was to destroy the game itself, to break the rules that had imprisoned him. But before he could act, the screen went black. The game was over. As Lucas turned off the devices, he realized a lesson he never imagined learning. True imprisonment isn't in the hands of those who observe us, but in our own insecurities and the stories we choose to live in order to please others. Sometimes, true freedom comes when we stop seeking external validation and begin connecting with our own essence. The digital game, with its lies and illusions, can be addictive, but only when we disconnect can we truly be who we are. Now, imagine the impact of taking a moment to reflect. Are you living your life for others or for yourself? Are you connected to social media because you need others' approval or because you genuinely want to share who you are? The lesson Lucas learned is one we all can carry. True connection begins from the inside out. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more impactful content like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to leave a like and comment on what you thought of the story. We want to hear your opinion. And if you're curious about the next video, click on some of the ones appearing now, where we'll dive into more mysteries about what happens when our online interactions take unexpected turns. See you in the next video.